Claire Donovan, a 36-year-old housewife, had lived in Maplewood for nearly a decade with her husband, Evan. To anyone looking from the outside, Claire seemed to have everything: a beautiful home, 2 children, and a stable marriage. But beneath the facade of her perfect suburban life, Claire felt isolated. Evan, a hard-working architect, was frequently traveling for work, leaving Claire feeling like more of a caretaker than a partner. Their conversations had become routine, their intimacy cold and distant. It was during one of Evan's many work trips that Claire's life began to change. Her closest friend, Laura Kendall, lived just a few doors down with her husband, Dean. Laura and Claire had been inseparable since the day they met, sharing everything from parenting advice to gossip over afternoon coffee. Laura was the life of every gathering, with her infectious laugh and warm personality. But behind the scenes, her marriage to Dean was far from perfect. Dean was a 40-year-old contractor, strong and quiet, the kind of man who exuded confidence without saying much. He and Laura had been married for years, but their relationship, like Claire's, had grown stale. It started innocently between Claire and Dean, a few casual conversations when Laura wasn't around. Dean would stop by Claire's house to fix things when Evan was out of town, offering to help with small repairs around the house. Claire, desperate for any form of connection, found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't anticipated. The first time they crossed a line, it had been late one evening after Dean had stopped by to fix a leaky faucet. They ended up sharing a bottle of wine on Claire's porch. The conversation flowed easily, much like the wine, and Claire felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: attention, real, undivided attention. Dean listened to her in ways Evan no longer did, and before the night ended, they exchanged a brief, electrifying touch that left them both reeling. Neither of them talked about what had happened that night, but the electricity between them lingered. Dean began stopping by more often under the guise of helping with household chores, but their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Claire felt a pull toward him that she knew was wrong, but she couldn't resist. What started as innocent glances and long conversations quickly escalated into something much more dangerous. By midsummer, the affair had fully taken root. They met in secret, hidden corners of the neighborhood, early mornings when the kids were at school, and even quick encounters in Dean's truck. The thrill of sneaking around, the adrenaline of hiding their secret from Laura and Evan, fueled their passion. Every stolen kiss, every forbidden touch sent Claire deeper into a world she had never imagined herself entering. The more time she spent with Dean, the more trapped she felt in her own life. Her once content existence now seemed like a prison. Yet as thrilling as the affair was, guilt gnawed at Claire. She was betraying her best friend and her husband. Every time she saw Laura, her stomach churned with shame. How could she do this to someone she cared so deeply about? But each time she considered ending it, the thought of losing Dean and the connection they shared was too much to bear. For Dean, the affair was equally intoxicating. Laura had grown distant, wrapped up in her own world, and Dean found in Claire what he had been missing for years: excitement and validation. He, too, was caught in a spiral of guilt and desire. They both knew the stakes were high, but the pull between them was impossible to ignore. As the weeks passed, Claire's paranoia began to grow. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, terrified that someone in the close-knit neighborhood would discover their secret. Maplewood was a place where everyone knew everyone's business, and Claire knew it was only a matter of time before their affair was uncovered. Every glance from a neighbor, every casual conversation with Laura, felt like a potential threat. The walls were closing in, and yet the risk only seemed to heighten the passion between Claire and Dean. Neither of them realized it yet, but their actions were setting off a chain of events that would soon spiral out of control. The lies they had woven would soon begin to unravel, and the consequences of their affair would be far more devastating than either of them could have imagined. In the peaceful town of Maplewood, a deadly storm was brewing, and it was only a matter of time before it struck. As the affair between Claire and Dean intensified, so did the weight of their secret. What had started as thrilling and intoxicating now felt dangerous and heavy. The excitement that once drove their encounters had begun to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. The once sneaky glances exchanged at neighborhood gatherings now carried an undercurrent of tension, and each stolen moment became riskier than the last. Claire's life was starting to unravel. Every morning felt like a performance, smiling through conversations with Laura while guilt gnawed at her insides. She could hardly look her friend in the eye anymore, afraid that her face would betray her. The fear of being caught was always present, especially in their tight-knit neighborhood where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. Claire had become hyper-aware of the neighbors, watching their faces for any sign of suspicion. Did they know? Could they tell? Dean, on the other hand, didn't seem to share the same paranoia. He was more confident, convinced that they were in the clear. He had become more brazen, suggesting they meet in riskier places, like the small wooded park at the edge of the neighborhood, or even in his truck just a few streets over from where Laura and Claire lived. His thrill-seeking attitude scared Claire. She was already on edge, and Dean's lack of caution only made things worse. Laura had started to notice something was off. Dean was more distant than usual, often brushing off her attempts to connect. She had grown used to his long hours and detached behavior, but lately something about him seemed different, more secretive. She mentioned it to Claire one afternoon while they were having coffee on the back porch. "Dean's been acting strange lately," Laura said, her voice tinged with concern. "I don't know what it is, but he's been distracted. He comes home late, and when I ask him where he's been, he gets defensive. It's like he's hiding something." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to keep her expression neutral. "Maybe it's just work," she said, forcing a smile. "Evan gets like that too when things are stressful at the office." Laura sighed, rubbing her temples. "Maybe. I just don't know anymore. Things between us haven't been right for a long time." Claire nodded, but her mind was racing. The pressure of maintaining her secret was becoming unbearable. Every conversation with Laura felt like walking on a tightrope. One wrong move and everything would come crashing down. Claire's guilt and anxiety began to affect her physically. She couldn't sleep, her appetite dwindled, and she found herself constantly on edge. Evan noticed the change in her, but when he asked if everything was okay, Claire brushed it off, claiming she was just tired. But the truth was, Claire was more than tired. She was exhausted by the double life she was living. Meanwhile, Dean grew increasingly impatient. He wanted more from Claire. Their secret rendezvous weren't enough for him anymore, and he began pushing her to leave Evan, to be with him openly. He promised her they could have a life together, away from the small-town gossip and their crumbling marriages. But Claire wasn't ready to blow up her life. The thought of losing everything, her family, her reputation, her friendship with Laura, was too much to bear. One evening, after an argument with Dean about the future of their relationship, Claire began to panic. She realized that she was in far deeper than she had ever intended. Dean was becoming possessive, demanding more of her time, more of her commitment, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it all together. That night, after Evan and the kids had gone to bed, Claire sat alone in the living room, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. She knew she had to make a choice, either end the affair and salvage what was left of her life, or continue down this dangerous path with Dean and risk everything. But the more she thought about it, the more trapped she felt. Ending things with Dean wouldn't be as simple as she hoped. He had become emotionally invested, and Claire feared how he might react if she tried to cut him out of her life. He wasn't the same man he had been when their affair started. Now, There was something darker, more demanding in his demeanor, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that he wouldn't let her go so easily. As the pressure built, Claire found herself caught between two worlds, one where she could continue the facade of her perfect suburban life, and another where the affair threatened to destroy everything she had ever known. The walls were closing in, and Claire had no idea how to escape. Claire had never imagined things could spiral so quickly out of control. What began as an affair fueled by passion had transformed into a situation she could no longer manage. Dean was becoming more volatile, pushing Claire toward a decision she wasn't ready to make. The man who once brought excitement into her life now filled her with dread. His possessiveness, once flattering, had become suffocating. Dean's constant demands were relentless. He no longer accepted their brief encounters as enough. He wanted more time, more attention, more commitment. He pressed Claire to leave Evan, telling her that they could start fresh somewhere, far away from Maplewood. But Claire knew it wasn't that simple. She had her children to think of, her reputation in the community, and the looming threat of what would happen if Laura ever found out. Their conversations turned into arguments, with Dean growing angrier and more impatient by the day. He couldn't understand why Claire wouldn't take the plunge and leave everything behind for him. In his mind, there was only one path forward, and Claire was standing in the way of it. One evening, after yet another heated argument, Dean said something that chilled Claire to the core. "If you don't leave Evan, I will," he warned. "I'll tell him everything. I'll tell Laura too. I'm not going to keep living like this." Claire stared at him, her mind reeling. Dean had always been forceful, but he had never threatened to reveal their secret before. She had known the affair was a ticking time bomb, but now it felt as though the timer was counting down faster than she could defuse it. Fear gripped her, tightening around her chest like a vice. After Dean stormed out of her house that night, Claire knew she had to take action. She couldn't let Dean go through with his threat, but she wasn't sure how to stop him. The affair had become a prison, and no matter what she did, the walls were closing in. The following days were tense. Dean stopped texting and calling as frequently, and the silence between them felt ominous. Claire tried to focus on her family, hoping that if she distanced herself from Dean, things would settle down. But the growing distance didn't ease her anxiety, it only amplified it. Then, one fateful evening, everything came crashing down. It was late, just after midnight, when Claire's phone rang. She had been unable to sleep, her mind restless from the pressure she was under. Seeing Dean's name on the caller ID made her stomach lurch. She hesitated for a moment before answering, bracing herself for whatever he might say. "Claire, I need you." Dean's voice was frantic, panicked in a way she had never heard before. "It's Laura. She found out. I don't know how, but she knows." The room around Claire seemed to tilt. "What do you mean she knows?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "She saw my phone, the messages between us. She's gone crazy. I didn't mean for this to happen, Claire, but I think I killed her." The words hit Claire like a freight train. She gripped the phone tighter, her heart pounding in her ears. "What are you talking about? What did you do?" "She confronted me, and I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't stop screaming. I lost control. I didn't mean to, I swear, but she's dead, Claire. I need your help." Claire's world began to spin. The affair had always felt dangerous, but she never imagined it could lead to this. Her best friend, the woman who trusted her more than anyone, was dead because of her betrayal, and now Dean was asking her to help him cover it up. "I can't," Claire stammered, her breath catching in her throat. "I can't do this, Dean." "You have to," Dean snapped, his panic turning to anger. "We're in this together. If I go down, you go down too. Do you think anyone will believe this wasn't your fault? They'll know we were having an affair. Your life will be over." Claire's mind raced. She could hardly breathe, let alone think clearly. If she didn't help him, Dean would surely expose everything. But if she did, she would be complicit in the murder of her best friend. Tears streamed down Claire's face as she made her way to Dean and Laura's house, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. She didn't know what she was going to do when she got there, but the weight of the situation pressed down on her like never before. Dean had crossed a line, and now she was being dragged deeper into the darkness. When she arrived, the sight of Laura's lifeless body on the floor brought everything into stark, horrifying clarity. The life they had both destroyed was lying there before her, and there was no escaping the reality of what they had done. Claire realized in that moment that there was no way out. The affair had gone too far, and the consequences had finally come knocking. The woman she had once called her closest friend was dead because of the choices she had made, and nothing would ever be the same again. Claire stood frozen in the doorway, staring at Laura's lifeless body sprawled on the living room floor. The weight of the moment crashed over her, suffocating her in its finality. Dean stood nearby, his hands shaking, his clothes stained with blood. His eyes, wild with panic, darted between Claire and the body. "We have to clean this up," Dean said, his voice trembling. "We can still fix this." Fix this. The absurdity of his words hit Claire like a punch. How could anything be fixed now? Laura was dead, her blood soaking into the carpet, and there was no undoing that. Yet, as much as Claire wanted to scream, to run, she found herself rooted in place, the full gravity of her situation pulling her deeper into despair. "What are we supposed to do?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "How are we going to explain this?" Dean took a step closer, his expression desperate. "We make it look like an accident. No one has to know. We clean everything, get rid of the evidence, and we stick to the story. It's the only way." Claire's heart raced as she stared at Laura's body. Her best friend, the woman who had trusted her, was dead because of her. Every decision she had made, the lies, the affair, it had all led to this. But now she had no choice. If she didn't help Dean, everything would come crashing down, and she would lose everything. Numbly, Claire agreed, unable to think of any other option. They worked in silence, scrubbing away the blood and wiping down surfaces. Every second felt like an eternity as Claire's mind raced, replaying every moment that had led her here. The weight of her guilt was unbearable, but fear kept her moving. Hours later, they had done all they could. The scene had been staged to look like an accident, a tragic fall in the middle of the night. But as they surveyed their work, the horror of what they had done still hung heavy in the air. Claire couldn't shake the image of Laura lying there, lifeless and cold. The following days were a blur. Laura's death was ruled suspicious but inconclusive, leaving the police without concrete evidence to move forward. However, the investigation continued, and as time passed, the tension between Claire and Dean grew unbearable. They could barely look at each other, the guilt between them festering like a wound that refused to heal. As detectives questioned the people close to Laura, the lies Claire and Dean told became harder to maintain. Claire's nerves were fraying, and every question felt like an accusation. The burden of keeping the secret was eating away at her, and the cracks in their story were beginning to show. Then, one day, it all came crashing down. The detectives found inconsistencies in Dean's alibi. A neighbor had seen someone leaving the house late that night, and it wasn't long before they discovered the affair. The text messages, the secret meetings, it all came to light. The investigation took a new turn, and Dean was arrested for Laura's murder. For Claire, the walls were closing in. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything she had tried to hide would be exposed. The police questioned her relentlessly, and eventually she broke. The weight of her guilt was too much to bear. Claire confessed to her part in the cover-up, admitting that she had helped Dean after the murder. The affair, the lies, the deception, it all came spilling out. In the end, both Claire and Dean were charged. Dean for murder, Claire as an accessory. Their lives, once filled with secret passion and dangerous desire, were now in ruins. The small town of Maplewood was left reeling from the scandal, and the people who had once been friends were now strangers, forever separated by betrayal and tragedy. Claire sat alone in her cell, staring at the grey walls surrounding her. She had lost everything: her family, her friendships, her freedom. The choices she had made in those fleeting moments of passion had destroyed everything she once held dear. There was no going back now, only the cold reality of the consequences she would live with for the rest of her life.